Thank you, everybody, for taking your time, for joining us in our third webinar in the webinar series by experts. And today we have Ben Mortenson, Associate Professor at the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy, Faculty of Medicine, University of British Columbia, and also Mike Prescott, Postdoctoral Research Fellow at University of British Columbia, Canada. And they will be presenting on the topic, adding navigation skills to the community mobility training of wheelchair users. The floor is all yours. Thank you so much.
Gracias. All right. So thank you for being here today. So introductions of ourselves in just a second. But if people are joining, if they could mute, that would be great. Oh, great, from Romania. I would like to acknowledge that both Mike and I are on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples in Vancouver, British Columbia. So that includes the Musqueam, Coast Salish, and I've lost them, Squamish peoples. Yeah. So Mike is a he's a postdoctoral fellow. He was my former PhD student. And right now he's at the Université de Laval in geometrics and rehabilitation sciences. And I'm an associate professor in occupational science and occupational therapy at the University of British Columbia. And so today we're going to be talking about community navigation and potential for training people in that topic. So we have the schedule today is we'll talk for about 5 minutes, mostly Mike, about community navigation. I'll just talk for a few minutes. I don't think I've got 5 minutes about wheelchair skills training. And we'll talk about some of the challenges of moving around the community in about 10 minutes. And Mike has a framework that he's going to offer up. And then we'd like to do maybe something a little different for this group is have some breakout rooms. So there'll be 2 breakout rooms and people can choose which room they want to go to. And then we'll come back, bring everyone back together for a bit of a discussion. And our goals are today is for you to understand about navigation, especially in the community, identify factors that can facilitate or act as barriers to mobility, and then also explore potential strategies for improving the community mobility of device users.
So I'll just start off by sort of putting some context around what we're going to talk about. And when we think about community navigation, our focus is mainly on once you're in your wheelchair or once you're walking around the community, but we have to understand it in this broader context of all the modes that might take place. And even if you are using transit or paratransit or taxi, you still end up having some of your trip being by foot or by wheel. And while I think this is sort of our next step is to understand better how all of this fits together. Again, our focus will be more on, okay, how are we getting there using active transportation in particular so that we can think of this as an area where people have sort of more control over it, because what we've found in our research is that having a car is so critical to where people can go, but those that use wheeled mobility devices often don't have vehicles, so they are really dependent on the walkability or wheelability of their neighborhoods and whether or not the resources they need are actually there. So it's a very complex situation. So we try to reduce it at this point to the active transportation component of it, and in particular, how you navigate through, and I'll describe that in the next slide here. So when we talk about community navigation, we're thinking about it through these sort of different lenses or overlapping issues that people have to deal with. And so there's a contextual one. So if I'm planning a trip, there's different reasons for why I'm doing it, and that might affect the routes I take, what I have to wear, and those kind of elements. So if, for instance, if I'm going for a job interview, I don't want to get all sweaty, so I'm going to try to find the route that's going to be require the least effort. And I need information to be able to make those decisions. So places where I'm more familiar, I'm more likely to take those routes. And so community navigation is simpler. However, something goes wrong along one of those routes, I need to be flexible enough to figure out a way to get around the barrier, let's say, that exists. And also, it could matter based on time of day, week, or in particular season, snow being a major barrier that we've found in our research and has been found in a lot of other research. Also, I think the two key elements that we'll focus on today is wayfaring and wayfinding. So I think most people are probably quite familiar with wayfinding. It's how do you get from A to B along the network of sidewalks and crosswalks in order to get to your destination. So that a lot of that is sort of like, again, it speaks to the information that you have or the familiarity you might have, but it also is about what's actually available. But we have to also consider wayfaring, which is sort of the experience of going through those spaces. And a lot of that has to do with whether or not it's accessible. And we'll talk about this in more detail in a moment. And that's not just the barriers that exist, it's also burden. So the amount of effort required to move to that environment. And what's often missed is am I able to enjoy it? So a lot of participants in our studies will say, yeah, I might be able to get through it, but I'd never get to enjoy the trip. I can't look at things as I go along because I'm focused on the ground. If I'm in a manual wheelchair, for instance, because anything might trip me up. So that differentiation between barrier and burden is quite important because we look at barriers as being sort of obstacles along the route that force you to find an alternate route. And this is different from burden, where let's say you could be on you could take the same route that's 100 meters long, but one is on a 10% slope, the burden of that route is going to be greater. Or if a barrier presents itself, then I have to go along a longer route, which will likely increase the burden as well. And so this picture we have, this map that we have here on the right, is actually one of our participants in a study where we asked them to go from point A to point B and in an unfamiliar environment and try to figure out how to get to that destination. So they mapped it out and then they tried to follow their plan. What turned out was that manual wheelchair users in particular ended up going 50% further than the shortest possible route, which again, that really impacts whether or not you're going to reach your destination, whether it's going to discourage future travel. So it's starting to show us that, and then there's differences between say scooters and power wheelchair users and manual wheelchair users. So it's very different, and the impacts there are based on wayfaring and wayfinding conditions.
Thanks, Mike. So one of the ways for teaching people about how to do wayfaring is wheelchair skills training. And so I'm probably speaking to the choir, but Dr. Kirby is sort of the grandfather in this area, and his wheelchair skills training program is, I would say, the gold standard. It has a 315-page manual that talks about how to train people to do different wheelchair skills, and it's talks about trains people to do power wheelchair skills, manual wheelchair skills, scooter skills, also has a caregiver section. And so it has a lot of training ideas, but it also is a complete training program. So there's also validated measures. So for all those groups that I just talked about, and you can measure people's skills objectively or subjectively. And the idea is that you measure people's skills, you train them, and then you measure people's skills and see whether you've actually improved their skills. And Dr. Kirby's, with some of the subjective stuff, he's not just moved on beyond the objective skills, which are capacity oriented, but got into some other interesting constructs. So looking at people's confidence, because we know confidence is a huge predictor of behavior. It's a far stronger predictor of behavior than capability. And that's the whole fear of falling thing. People may be able to do activities, but because they're scared, they don't do them. And you end up with a negative feedback loop, in fact. So you end up doing fewer activities because you're afraid of falling, so that your capacity actually decreases over time. And then I would argue the same is true with wheelchair skills. If you're afraid to do the skill that you can do, then you won't use it, and it will become vestigial. So it's, as I say, it's a great program and totally recommend it. But I would also argue it doesn't cover all the skills necessary for people to move out the community independently. And another example I would add is around wheelchair maintenance. So his program doesn't talk about wheelchair maintenance. It's all about the wayfaring. And but don't be sad. We actually developed a program for that, and I've put a hyperlink there. It's called iwheel.ca, and it's a freely available program to train people how to repair manual wheelchairs. So, and we've done some research on it, and we're still trying to publish it right now. So if you get invited to review a paper about a program like that, it's an awesome paper, and you should approve it. Oops, did I say that out loud? Maybe I did. But lastly, one of the areas which we're going to talk about today is around wayfinding. So that's an area that currently isn't covered at all in the wheelchair skills training program. Yeah.
So I thought I would ask people to take off. I'm going to stop the share for a second and or ask people to answer this question. So if you, I guess if you can put up your hand or just speak out, trying to understand, what do you think the key challenges that wheelchair and scooter users face navigating the community? So you can feel free to take off your mute and share with the group.
Okay, I'll go first.
Okay.
I have found over the years that it's fear of the unknown. It's not that they don't think that they can do it, sort of to what you were saying before, but it's fear of the unknown when they're going someplace that they're not familiar with.
And would you say that that they may not have the skills to deal with that unfamiliarity, or is it something deeper than that?
No, I think they have the skills to deal with the unfamiliarity. And most of my practice in this area was in Chicago. So it wasn't a fear of getting out there. It was a fearing of what they would find, like giant potholes or blocked ramps, things that physically they had no way to get around unless they went into the middle of a 6-lane road, that kind of thing.
And I see in the chat that someone actually mentioned potholes in particular, and mountains. Yeah, I know we went on a trip recently where it seems like every single route that you take was uphill. And we have buildings being inaccessible. I think too that what the Coleman's washroom comment is extremely, that's something in particular that does seem to get addressed, because I think a lot of communities are sort of scared of offering up public washrooms and what might happen and stuff like that, but it's such an incredibly important component. Are there?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have an accessible washroom, and you have to use the washroom regularly, then you're probably not going to leave your house, or at least not go in that area where you don't know where a washroom is that you can access, for sure.
Right.
And Ali talks about most users living in rough environment. So that could be, I suppose, rural, or it could just be the terrain, I suppose. Anyone else want to comment by unmiking or add a comment box. I know, Mike, you've told me about how one of the issues you sometimes encounter is that there's like when you're out wheeling, there'll be a sidewalk obstruction, and you think, oh, okay, well, I won't go that way. But then later on, you still don't go that way, even though the sidewalk's been repaired. So there's might be a bit of a communication issue too.
Right. So accessibility can exist, but if your perception of it, and I think that Susan sort of touched on this as well, if your perception of the accessibility is that it's inaccessible, then it might as well be inaccessible. And it sort of also speaks to the fact that information, again, whether it's online or in the real world, needs to match. Often you'll find that there'll be sidewalk construction, and they'll put the detour sign for pedestrians right in front of the obstruction, which means having to go back. And again, that increases burden because you've now forced me to double back on a path, which was actually in that map that I showed you. That one person who ended up going, I think, basically twice the distance than they needed to, had to hit a dead end. Actually, it was a perceived dead end. It wasn't a dead end. It was a shortcut, but there was no way of knowing because the information wasn't there. The uncertainty that Susan talked about it's like, okay, if I'm not sure, I'm going to try to take the simplest route, or the one that's along major routes, because that was something that came up. People's initial strategies for choosing routes was, what's the shortest distance? That was still the number one choice. But when it came to reality, it was like, oh, I just feel mentally safer choosing the main routes because I can feel, okay, they're not likely to have any problems along the way.
And I guess I would also add, we've got a few more things here. So Marlon Santos says most people with disabilities live far from the city. So the type of activity or all-terrain wheelchairs are important. And folks don't want to get lost or rerouted, especially when it's too cold or too hot. That can be dangerous. Yeah, and in Canada, it's usually the too cold part. But in other places, I can imagine too hot would be an issue. I'll try and really use my imagination for that. And then what about the third world or low and middle income nations? What modifications should you do? The wheelchairs and curriculums. Okay, good. And I guess one other maybe point I would make is that it's interesting how accessibility is affected by social practices. So in our research, we've seen things like, oh yes, there's a lovely ramp, but they use it to store plants on. So the ramp is really not accessible. Becomes a plant stand, not an accessibility feature. Or people store things in the accessible washroom because there's more room in the accessible washroom. So the accessible washroom becomes inaccessible. Or the famous, and I don't know if you guys have this other places, but we have these things called sandwich boards. So businesses will put out this little board that goes up and down in front of their shop to sort of say, oh, come in here. But it takes room away from the sidewalk and encroaches. And if you're walking, you can get a walk around these things. But if you're in a wheelchair, sometimes that's the difference between the sidewalk being accessible and the sidewalk being inaccessible. Do you want to add anything there, Mike?
No, I think that's good.
All right.
Okay. So what was talked about here is very similar to the findings from one of our studies where we asked about 60 people to brainstorm that question, basically. What factors affect the route, routes that you take to reach destinations in your community? And then this group would then group those into however they thought they belong together and rated the importance of them. And then there's software that can then figure out how to create what this map that you see there is called a cluster map. And the height of each of those clusters, it relates to how important that cluster of factors was to the overall to the group. And so we found that for this group that being ready to go and planning the trip had certain factors, and then enjoying the trip. And then there were the ones on the bottom, which were sort of the more typical things that we think about in terms of infrastructure and obstacles and hazards, as we've been talking about, and health and weather. And so from that map, we developed this sort of model of understanding the process, because I think when we look at it just as these separate features and entities, we miss the bigger picture of the fact that if one of those elements is substandard or is inaccessible or unsafe, then again, it's kind of like, well, the whole journey chain breaks down and someone won't be able to use that route. So this process involves, as I said, there's this preparation that's involved, and the important factors there were whether or not the device that they were using was in optimal condition. And I can imagine in rural scenarios and in lower income countries that in particular would probably be elevated, because if things break down, you need to find parts. And then the actual planning. And this is where, you're thinking about how far, how long is it going to take, and have that that will also influence the route that you want to take. And then ultimately the accessibility at the destination will influence how much you enjoy it. So underneath those things are these sort of contextual factors like weather, rain and cold being two of the more important ones. Fear of crime came up, but snow was number one for us. And I'm sure that especially for those who may be susceptible to not being able to sweat, and if you're in a high temperature situation, that's obviously you're going to have to reduce the distance that you're going to want to travel. And then hazards like having clear sight lines. So in particular, we have a lot of sidewalks where people will have hedges that block the sight line for when cars come out. So that will, I often will either go on the road or choose the side of the sidewalk that has fewer driveways that intersect with it, as well as the fact that those driveways are often at like a 10% cross slope. So these are sort of, all these things are going in my head in terms of calculating how to get there. And it's not easy to do if you don't have that information, but even when you do have that information, can be a complex process. But ultimately, sidewalks and curb ramps, I think, is a universal thing. When you don't have those, you're less likely to use that route. And so another way of looking at it that I've come up with is, as I'm moving through the environment, I have these 4 information horizons that I sort of draw on. And a lot of this is sort of just tacitly happening in my head, but my personal space is sort of the next few pushes or steps that I might take. And it's going to be really rich in wayfaring information. So if there's a tree route, I'm going to know to have to pop a wheelie to get over that tree route. Not very much information about how to get to my ultimate route, though. The next space is sort of what I call the foreground space, which is, again, it's quite rich in wayfaring information, but it also contains some wayfinding information. So it's starting to, I can see ahead that there's a street crossing. So I'm probably going to have to make a decision in terms of my wayfinding, but I also can see enough of, it does have a sidewalk. There is a curb ramp coming ahead. And then beyond that is the background space, where it's really mostly about wayfinding. I might get at a bit of I can see it's a steep slope, but other than that, I can't really tell much. And then ultimately there's a sort of these global landmarks that might exist. So in Vancouver, we've got our North Shore Mountains, which help us figure out, if I see those mountains, I know at least north, and that might help me to a certain degree to figure out if I'm headed on the right route. we're ahead of schedule. What we wanted to do now is to do 2 breakout groups. And so we have 2 topics that we'd like you to choose from. And in those breakout groups, we'd like you to introduce yourselves to each other, assign one person to take notes and one person that can sort of report back to the larger group. And we'll have Ben or myself. I will be in the environment group, and Ben will be in the personal strategies group to assist as needed. And so the questions are for the personal strategies group: what personal strategies or actions could be used to improve community navigation for wheeled mobility device users? And this, basically the same question, but about environmental strategies or actions that could be used to improve navigation for wheeled mobility device users. So I will let them show stop the share, I guess. And are there any questions before we go into our breakout groups? No, okay. So
I'll be in the personal strategies group, and Mike's going to be in the environmental strategies group. So yeah, just head on in there, because then we'll see where people are going and how's it working. If anyone stays out here, we'll get someone else to help them get into the room.
Yes, Mike.
Okay,
Welcome
is
back.
Ben done?
We have a 35-second timeout, so they're still in the other room.
I should have wrote down the times myself. Oh, that's right. I know my group was, I'm the one that put the instructions in, and I didn't follow my own instructions, but
Like we have the entire group back.
Hey, Mike, did you have a lot of people in your group?
it's hard to tell. I think I had about 20, yeah.
Okay.
You not so much?
Mine was less popular, but I think that speaks more about you than me.
Oh, yeah.
It was nice though, because then we actually got to introduce everyone. So that wasn't that we could be that easily in our group.
Hello.
Okay.
Is everyone back at this point?
Yes, we have everyone back.
Okay, so we will, I think, just sort of go over some of the discussion points that you had in your group. I forgot to assign somebody to do that. I don't know if maybe Mary looks like she really wants to be our representative. If not, I can go. Let's there, Mary. But
I don't
let's
mind.
start with,
Yeah, why don't you pop it in, Mike, to clarify what I missed. But
yeah.
Mike asked us, what kinds of strategies, and I think I actually proposed a personal strategy, but I was only just trying to draw on what I felt was my most relevant experience relating to a community navigation app that I've been involved with a little bit with a colleague here in our School of Computing and Information. And then Susan brought up points relating to, well, what do you do? Or Mike was talking about the contextualization of, well, are these tools or could they be available all around the world? And Susan said, it doesn't matter where you live or what wheelchair you have, but if you have snow and ice, that's super challenging. And then we talked a little bit about what might be available for the beach and trying to think, I guess, across conditions, what might be able to work. And acknowledging that, of course, those are bulky and aren't your everyday style of equipment, or aren't going to be functional in that way. And then Mike posed a kind of grand challenge question to the group of what happens, like what kind of government type support and advocacy could there be to try to just make the environment more conducive all the way around. How'd I do?
Right.
Mike, Susan,
Excellent.
you want to jump in?
I think
awesome.
too, we kind of got at the fact that, that those wayfaring and wayfinding questions as they relate to community navigation, in some places, wayfaring is just so dominant in terms of its impact on navigation. If you live in a mountainous region, or if you live somewhere where it's really hot, you're going to have, your choices are going to be less, and you're going to have to be, what I was trying to get across was, even if it's a place where there's lots of options, that being strategic about how you address the navigation challenge is what's truly important. And that means being very strategic with the limited resources that governments often have to address accessibility. And though we didn't talk about it, I would say that from my experience, and again, others can chime in, accessibility and community navigation are usually thought of in that way. They're kind of like, oh, it just sort of meets standards kind of thing approach to how navigation and accessibility are approached. And we need to be a little more strategic rather than being fully democratic in terms of how we address this challenge is less important than understanding how, well, if we have these limited resources, we want to really focus them on delivering the most return. And that might mean getting a better lay of the land in terms of its accessibility, and maybe where signage exists, and or dealing with temporary barriers in a way that is going to really take advantage of those limited resources and be focused on delivering a more accessible mobility experience for as many people as possible.
Yeah, and I guess to riff on that, I guess part of it is also that in terms of resources, you may actually work on making like nodes that are accessible, rather than saying, okay, everyone has to have an accessible washroom, but you spend all this money making accessible washrooms all over the place, but you can't get into the building where the accessible washroom is, or there's no transit to that place. So you've spent all these resources creating islands of accessibility that are not accessible. And that would be a waste of resources. Also, it was interesting, the idea about policy, I think is really interesting. And because in Canada, we definitely have some interesting examples. So in Vancouver, snow is not the responsibility, removal is not the responsibility of the city, whereas in Montreal it is. So in Montreal, after a snowfall, the city workers go out and they clear all the sidewalks, usually within about 8 hours, I would say. They're very aggressive. Whereas in Vancouver, it's the responsibility of the homeowner. And there's a great example where we had all this snow one winter, and there was a bunch of people who, like, we have a lot of absentee homeowners, or people who are renting and they don't clear their snow, or even owners who don't clear their snow. And so you have streets where, some people would, some people wouldn't clear their snow, but that's useless to someone using a mobility device, because now you've got like ice or snow drifts, and then a beautiful sidewalk, and then blah, blah, blah. And then the city, in their wisdom, they got a lot of flack about that. So they issued fines to all the people who hadn't shoveled. They issued the fines in July, 6 months after the events had occurred. So completely useless. Sorry, little soapbox. Mike, did you want me to talk about the things from our group?
Yeah.
Okay, we're running down on time. So some people talk about working on wayfaring. So just the idea of, because accessibility is person related. So if you can teach people how to go over a curb, then all of a sudden you don't need a curb cut. So that actually improves your accessibility, or cardiovascular fitness, all those kind of things. There was a lot of talk actually about sort of technological solutions, which I guess are a little bit environmental versus personal. So like, what could we do things around obstacle detection or wayfinding technologies, like with cameras on people's chairs? We did talk about some of the issues with some of those things, and that a lot of, with smart cars, we'll be able to borrow a lot of smart car technology for power wheelchair use, or even manual wheelchair use probably. But the issue is they don't detect drop-offs, because cars don't have curves that they have to go down or up. So that's a bit of a challenge. And because there is a product called Braze that does backup sensing, but as one of our participants was saying, it doesn't detect drop-offs. So that's a little dangerous. And then finally, we did get it, and there was an idea around maybe doing some stuff around wayfinding, like within spaces, so that maybe a mall could actually figure out how to communicate with people with disabilities and help people with wayfinding within those spaces. And then finally, we did talk about actually personal training and maybe some strategies that we could use in terms of, practicing. So practicing the skills to be able to go about them in the community. How do you read a map? How do you plan a route? What do you do when your route fails? Those kind of skills.
And that's interesting, because I put up the last slide here just to show one thing that we've presented in the past is working with individuals to develop. Let's say someone's new, just came out of rehabilitation and is going either to a new home or returning home, but it's a different environment because now they're using a mobility device. And so you could have them use technology, like simple technology like Google Maps or Google Earth, and actually map out where they want to go in the community and take a look through Street View as to, taking note of what challenges are along the way. So that allows them to figure out, okay, are there environmental solutions that need to be in place? Maybe I need to advocate for a curb ramp, or are there things that we can do? You might do like, oh, well, lots of my routes are long, so I really need to work on endurance. And so you can start to develop this sort of mobility strategy, personal mobility strategy that takes into consideration all the factors that we kind of talked about. And that can be sort of feed into a more strategic way of addressing personal community mobility, and it, again, just using simple technologies to talk about some of the things that we discussed in our groups. And it's just amazing how international the individuals were in our groups, and the challenges are very different, obviously, between countries. And I think that's one area that probably needs a lot of work.
Oh, you got
so again.
That should be UBC for me, not SFU. I don't know where the SFU came from.
I don't know.
I'll put it in the chat. So we've got only like 3 minutes left, but we'll just open it to questions or comments from the group. Oh, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Mary.
I hope the one thing that we gain from this discussion is that there's no simple answers to a lot of these, but to understand the complexity of navigation, being at so many different levels, but there are also so many different potential solutions that will be available, that and learning from each other. That's one thing I really hope that we can build on, is being able to share information in the future about where things work. So like this morning, I was watching a video of somebody who just designed an off-road wheelchair to be able to actually use in snowy parks or on the beach. And so there are things going on, but they tend to sort of sputter sometimes, or especially things when it comes to accessibility maps. So many people have started them, they fizzle away, and then someone else will come in and it's reinventing the wheel to provide that information. But we kind of have a good understanding of what the needs are, but we haven't sustained strategies and solutions for them. So I think these discussions hopefully build towards that that broader goal of providing, again, as our group kind of pointed out, with information being a critical component.
Great, thanks everyone for your comments and for taking part. And email us if you have any further questions or want further dialogue.
Thank you so much, Ben and Mike, for your time. We really appreciate it. And I will follow up the rest of the participants with the recording and some of the links shared in this presentation. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, evening, afternoon. Bye.